Sarah carefully turned the old brass key in the lock of her grandmother's attic trunk, heart fluttering as the lid popped open with a long, creaking groan. Dust motes danced in the morning light, swirling around her. The attic smelled faintly of mothballs and old paper, that peculiar perfume of memory. She gingerly reached inside, fishing out scattered keepsakes, a tarnished locket, brittle letters tied with ribbon. Tucked beneath a stack of faded quilt squares, she encountered a large bundle of cloth in soft, muted colors, the edges fraying like the delicate pages of an antique book. She recognized it instantly. The family's heirloom quilt, rumored to be older than any living relative. Though her mother had often mentioned its existence, Sarah had never seen it in person. It was a tapestry of pastel squares, each patch intricately stitched with patterns of flowers, vines, and swirling shapes. Some squares appeared nearly threadbare, while others were in relatively good condition, as though they had been replaced or repaired over time. The moment she pulled it out, she felt the weight of her family's history tucked in those threads. She draped the quilt over a wooden trunk next to the solitary attic window. Specks of light landed across the patches, making their detailed patterns shimmer like hidden runes. Sarah ran her hand gently over the cloth, marveling at the patient, precise handiwork. Thin lines of intricately embroidered vines and blossoms wove in and out of each square, connecting them into a single, coherent piece. She had heard family lore that each generation contributed at least one patch, yet no one had ever spoken of the quilt in detail. It was as if over time the family had simply accepted its presence without investigating the stories pieced together within it. Drawn by an impulse that felt almost sacred, Sarah traced her finger around the edges of one patch on the upper left corner. The design was simple, a cluster of bright daisies. The hand-stitched lines seemed to invite her closer, whispering secrets of days long past. She noticed a faint scrawl at the bottom edge of the patch, elegantly penned in small looping letters. The signature was barely legible, but Sarah made out the name, Margaret Bell. Her heart jolted with surprise. Margaret Bell had been her great-great-grandmother. Sarah had learned only bits and pieces about Margaret's life, that she had grown up in a small coastal town, that she loved painting seascapes at dusk, and that she'd died young, leaving behind a small child. No one in the family had known much else, but here, on this unassuming daisy patch, Margaret Bell had left a clue. "I found hope in the daisies." The phrase reeled Sarah in. She turned the corner of the quilt, investigating every inch as if reading a roadmap of her lineage. It took a moment of searching to notice that nearly every patch contained a hidden inscription. Some scrawled in corners, others concealed in the lines of embroidered vine. Each one was a short reflection, a memory. Our first harvest after the drought. She said yes under the willow tree. A war ended, but a battle raged within. Some had names attached, others not. Together, they created a tapestry of invisible stories, threads that wove the story of her ancestors deeper than any family tree outline. A wave of reverence swept over Sarah. She realized the quilt was more than just an artifact that had passed from grandmother to mother to child. It was a living chronicle, each square capturing a moment in time when someone had found cause for hope, resilience, or love. Yet no one had mentioned these inscriptions, at least not in her lifetime. She wondered if time had reduced the quilt's significance to a relic, its stories hidden until someone cared enough to look. Making her way downstairs, carrying the quilt as tenderly as if it were a child, Sarah found a seat by the living room window. She laid the quilt over her lap, determined to read each patch. The morning light streamed in, illuminating the cramped handwriting in ways that the dim attic had not allowed. Now rows of faint text came to life. She started in one corner. The swirl of lavender fabric was embellished with a stylized sun. Beneath its rays, the words, 1934 was the hardest year, but there was light even in the darkest days. Evelyn Grace. Sarah recalled her grandmother telling stories about Evelyn Grace, who had married into the family just before the Great Depression. She had lost her husband early to a factory accident. And yet, the simple phrase, that mention of light in the darkest days, told of an indomitable spirit. Sarah couldn't help but let her tears fall onto the square. She moved on, letting her fingers graze each square and pausing to decode the hidden lines. Scarlet patch with swirling embroidery read, "I never thought I'd find joy again after we lost him, but the orchard bloomed anew." Amelia Elizabeth, 1946, The Orchard. That must have been the orchard on the old farmland near the river. She closed her eyes, imagining the heartbreak that must have accompanied losing someone so dear in the aftermath of the war, followed by the gentle renewal that nature provided. As she moved through more squares, she recognized the names of relatives she had heard in bedtime stories or seen in photo albums. They came alive before her eyes now, telling their tales in raw, scribbled confessions. One patch displayed a patchwork of two flags, an American flag on one side and a Canadian flag on the other. The text read, "The border could not keep out friendship. Clara and Agnes, 1962." It was an intriguing clue, as Sarah knew from family legend that there had been a strong friendship between an American cousin and a Canadian neighbor during a tumultuous time. So many glimpses into the family's private struggles and hope-filled moments. Finally, she arrived at a patch that seemed newer compared to the rest, a soft sky blue piece featuring a single white feather. The stitching was more modern and used a thread that sparkled faintly in the sunlight. The writing, perfectly legible, read, "Believe in miracles. Helen, 1992. Helen, her grandmother." Sarah remembered that year well. She had been just a child, but she recalled how her grandmother had recovered from a near-fatal bout of pneumonia. Doctors had said it was a miracle that she pulled through, and there, on this delicate square, lay Helen's testament to that incredible second chance at life. Until that moment, Sarah hadn't realized she was holding her breath. Carefully, she thumbed the edges of the quilt, gazing at the kaleidoscope of shapes and colors that carried the weight of love and loss, perseverance and faith. She realized that her grandmother had never explained this final patch, nor had she revealed any of the stories embedded in the other patches. Perhaps it was her grandmother's hope that Sarah would be the one to discover them at the right time. At dusk, when the day's cleaning was done, Sarah set the quilt aside to phone her mother. Rebecca picked up, her voice threaded with fatigue. She'd been handling her mother's estate from afar, juggling lawyers and endless documents. "It's a long story," Sarah teased. "Remember that old quilt Grandma used to mention? I found it in the attic, and there's more to it than just stitching. Each patch has hidden words, little stories from our ancestors." There was a silence on the line. "Hidden stories? I had no idea," Rebecca replied. "But it does sound like something your grandmother would do. She always believed that every moment, every lesson should be recorded somehow." Sarah smiled. "I think we should gather the family. Everyone deserves to know about this." A few days later, her mother and other close relatives traveled to the farmhouse. They arrived to find Sarah seated by the fireplace, the quilt neatly laid out on a low table. Kerosene lamps and candles added a cozy warmth to the room. Supper waited in the kitchen, but no one seemed able to tear themselves away from the quilt's promise of family secrets. They took turns reading different squares aloud. While Sarah had already perused many of the inscriptions, watching her mother, aunt, and cousins discover them for the first time stirred something in her. Alyssa, her 15-year-old cousin, carefully read out the words from the Scarlet Orchard Patch Amelia, Elizabeth's story of hope after loss. Tears shimmered in her eyes, as if she suddenly understood that those who came before her had experienced heartbreaks and triumphs just as real as any modern teenage despair. Her uncle Jonathan, who rarely dwelled on sentimental matters, found himself transfixed by a square dedicated to a pair of wedding rings embroidered in golden thread. The inscription read, "Under this roof we united two families into one, Mary and Charles, 1910. Jonathan sighed. "I had no idea Mary and Charles were the ones who built the original barn. I wish I'd known them." Rebecca read some squares as well, and the deeper she delved, the more she seemed to reconnect with lost parts of herself. When she came to their grandmother's square, Helen's conversation with miracles, there was a unified. They remembered the hospital visits and the subsequent fear that she might not survive, but she had, and she had quietly commemorated that triumph in the quilt. Soon, conversation bubbled like a newly discovered spring. Stories surfaced about each ancestor's legacy, how Margaret Bell's daisies might have been painted onto porcelain cups that had since vanished, how Evelyn Grace's orchard had been sold off a generation ago, and how Mary and Charles's old barn had collapsed after a brutal storm in the 1990s. It was as though the quilt had become an anchor, reorienting them to their roots. They laughed, cried, and reveled in the memories, each patch reinforcing the bond they shared. Night settled in, and many of the relatives departed for nearby hotels. Only Sarah and her mother remained in the farmhouse as they sifted through the last of the estate paperwork. Despite the day's emotional weight, a feeling of peace filled the quiet house. Before heading to bed, Sarah walked by the living room. The quilt, folded neatly, rested on the table. She paused, noticing something she hadn't before. A small corner near the binding looked unfinished. It was a pale patch, almost blank, embroidered only with faint swirling lines but no central design. She knelt down and turned the fabric toward the lamplight. The swirl of the pattern reminded her of an empty scroll or an open book waiting to be filled. Carefully, she ran her fingertip over a space that seemed intentionally left plain. Until that moment, Sarah had assumed the entire quilt was complete, but here was a patch awaiting someone's contribution. Why else would it be unadorned? It struck her suddenly. Each generation had left behind a patch. Perhaps this empty one was waiting for her. The thought both thrilled and intimidated her in equal measure. She was no master quilter, nor did she have the same calligraphy skill as some of her ancestors. Yet, there was a tug inside her heart that made it impossible to ignore. The quilt was a living, breathing testament to her family, and if tradition held, she was next in line. She climbed into bed that night, imagining what she might contribute. She let her mind wander over her life experiences, the triumphs of earning her college degree, the heartbreak of her fiancé calling off their wedding, the reassurances of her grandmother's unwavering love. A swirl of images filled her mind. In each recollection, she felt the presence of her forebears, encouraging her to find her own thread of hope. The next morning, she talked to her mother about it over coffee. The late autumn sun filtered through the kitchen curtains, lighting up the steam rising from their mugs. Outside, the farmland sloped gently away, the skeletal trees hinting at winter's approach. "I think the quilt is incomplete," Sarah said, gently stirring her coffee. "There's an empty space near the binding. I believe it's intended for the next generation's story." Rebecca nodded, both surprise and pride warming her gaze. "It must be. Your grandmother never told me directly, but she hinted that you'd be the keeper of the quilt someday. She always said that only someone with a deep appreciation for history would treat it with proper reverence, and she admired the way you treasured family stories." Sarah hesitated. "But what if I don't do it justice? I'm not half as skilled at sewing as those who came before me." Her mother gently laid a hand on hers. "The beauty of this quilt is in its imperfections and personal touches. You don't have to stitch a masterpiece, you just have to share your truth." That evening, Sarah set up a small sewing station beside the window. She rummaged through her grandmother's old sewing supplies, picking out a needle and a spool of teal thread, the same color as her grandmother's favorite scarf. She found a pen with indelible ink designed for fabric, remembering she'd seen her mother use such pens for labeling. The house was quiet except for the occasional groan of the heating system. The smell of cinnamon potpourri lingered, giving the space a cozy aura. Her hands trembled as she began. First, she lightly traced her design in pencil. She decided on a simple motif, a small bird in flight, wings stretched wide as though seizing a fresh breeze. Around the bird, she wanted to encircle a single word, or maybe a short phrase, that encapsulated what she had learned. "Courage to begin anew," she wrote tentatively, the letters curving around the perimeter of the bird's spread wings. She paused and surveyed the phrase. The word courage encapsulated how she felt in the wake of her grandmother's passing, the end of one chapter and the uncertain start of another. She'd been reconsidering her career path, uncertain if she should remain in the city or move back to the farmhouse. She had wrestled with the heartbreak from her broken engagement, doubting her ability to find love again. And yet, here she was, forging ahead, reading the stories of triumph, hope, and resilience that her ancestors had woven. Each patch reminded her that no matter how dire the challenges had been, war, depression, illness, or grief, they had found the strength to persevere. Perhaps that was the legacy she had inherited, the courage to start over, to trust in new beginnings. Under the lamplight, she stitched the outline of the bird, using the teal thread to form the graceful curve of its wings. Though her hand was unsteady at first, each motion became more confident. The repetitive motion of the needle dipping in and out of the fabric soothed her nerves, lulling her into a calm, reflective state. When she finished the outline, she begrudgingly admitted it looked charming in its own imperfect way. Then she carefully inked the words "courage to begin anew" below the bird, letting the swirl of the lines follow the wings. When she finished, she sat back, releasing a long, slow breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. She flipped the patch over to inspect the backside, the knot of thread secure. "This is mine," she whispered, tears welling in her eyes. She thought of each family member who had once stood over their own square, finding just the right words to pass down. She looked at the names penned so many decades and even centuries ago, and felt a kinship with those long gone. Despite the passage of time, the bond remained unbroken. The next day, she showed her mother. Tears shone in Rebecca's eyes. "Your grandmother would be so proud," she said softly. "You've given our family a new story to hold on to." In the days that followed, word spread through the family that Sarah had discovered the quilt's hidden messages and added her own. Cousins asked if they could see it. Aunts and uncles reminisced about times they spent with her grandmother. An outpouring of letters and calls flooded Sarah's inbox. Some relatives even found old diaries and photos that corresponded to certain patches, providing more context to the quilt's cryptic inscriptions. Sarah began compiling these materials, scanning photos and transcribing diaries, thinking she might create a family album that paired each heirloom patch with the deeper story behind it. She knew it would be tedious and time-consuming, but she felt a compulsion to do it. The same compulsion that had driven her ancestors to hide hopeful messages in the quilt now propelled her to preserve and share them. In the quiet hours when she felt overwhelmed, she would run her fingertips over her newly stitched bird, reminding herself of that simple but powerful phrase, "courage to begin anew." One misty afternoon, Sarah ventured into the barn behind the farmhouse to look for anything else that might connect to the quilt's stories. Stashed in an old cabinet, she discovered an unmarked box filled with black and white photographs, some frayed at the corners, many featuring faces she only dimly recognized. But on the back of one photo, she spotted a date, June 12th, 1962. Beside the date, in careful cursive, was written Clara and Agnes's shared birthday. It depicted two women laughing, arms around each other, the flags of the US and Canada in the background. Here they were, the duo whose friendship soared across borders, presumably connected to the patch that read, "The border could not keep out friendship." Sarah's heart sparked with wonder at how a single photograph could bring the words on the quilt to life. She gathered those artifacts, along with letters and diaries, forming a growing tapestry of her own. The quilt acted like a magnet, pulling together lost fragments of the family's collective history, ensuring none were left behind. It was as if the ancestors themselves were stirring, whispering to the present, reminding everyone that time didn't erase love or memory. It simply required someone willing to look closer. As the final step, Sarah decided to place the quilt on a wooden display rack in the living room. The farmhouse, inherited jointly by her mother and uncle, would remain a shared family retreat, hosting gatherings for holidays and summertime reunions. She placed a small sign beside the quilt, explaining its significance and encouraging relatives to read the hidden inscriptions. She hoped younger generations would find in it the same sense of connection and awe she had. After all, there were countless stories of perseverance written in nearly invisible ink, waiting for open hearts. The following weekend, relatives of all ages descended upon the farmhouse for a celebration of life, honoring her grandmother. It was part memorial, part family reunion. The living room and the quilt quickly became a focal point. Cousins in their teens and early 20s huddled around it, pointing out squares and exclaiming over names they recognized from old anecdotes. Elder family members smiled knowingly, recalling the grandparents or great aunts who had once inhabited those squares. In the midst of laughter and reuniting, Sarah's mother stepped forward with an announcement. Holding a small journal in her hands, she said, "This belonged to Helen. I recently found it wrapped in the same linen that held the quilt. It has some final words from her that I believe she wanted all of us to hear." Silence fell. Rebecca opened the journal and read aloud. "I kept thinking there must be a better way to preserve our stories, a way that didn't place them on a shelf to be forgotten. Then I realized our stories should wrap us up in warmth and comfort, just like a quilt on a winter's day. That is why in each stitch, I wrote a part of our legacy. You, my family, can find us here, each generation meeting the next in a shared embrace. May the quilt remind you of who you are and where you came from, and perhaps you will add your own mark when the time is right." Rebecca's voice wavered on those final words. A hush lingered, every eye gazing at the quilt. Sarah smiled through a sheen of tears, knowing how fitting her grandmother's wish had been. The time had indeed come, and Sarah had added her own patch, forging a link in the family's ongoing chain of hope and resilience. When the gathering concluded, hugs and goodbyes fluttered through the house like echoes of a lullaby. People drifted away, carrying with them the recollection of luminous squares and ancestral whispers. Sarah stood by the quilt for a moment longer, tracing the intricate vines that bound each patch to the next. It was both comforting and exhilarating to realize that she would not be the last to leave a mark. Someday, a grandchild, a niece, or a nephew would find that final blank patch, and another corner waiting to be filled with a fresh story. Life would go on as it always had, but the quilt would remain to remind them that they were part of something larger than themselves. That night, a gentle wind rattled the farmhouse windows, and rain brushed softly against the panes. Sarah could barely sleep, her mind alive with the day's events. In the glow of the bedside lamp, she opened her grandmother's journal once more, flipping to the page marked by a piece of pressed lavender. In reading Helen's words, she felt her grandmother's presence as though she were in the room. She could almost smell the delicate lavender perfume Helen favored. Turn by turn, the pages revealed a simple but profound truth, that even in the throes of sorrow, there is comfort in belonging. The next morning dawned crisp and clear, sunlight reflecting off puddles in the driveway. Sarah rose early, drawn to the scent of fresh coffee wafting from the kitchen. She passed by the living room, pausing once more before the quilt. A shaft of light illuminated the very place where her bird soared in teal thread. She thought of her grandmother's unwavering faith, of the orchard that blossomed after the war, of the daisies that gave Margaret Bell hope, and of every other thread woven into this cloth. Each piece was a miniature testament to enduring love. She let her fingers gently brush against her square, feeling the slight texture of the stitched bird. A stirring of gratitude filled her for all the people who had come before, every heartbreak, every joy, and every triumph now enfolded in these patches. She felt especially grateful for Helen, whose gentle foresight had ensured that their stories would endure. Even after the heartbreak, the losses, and the passing of time, they were knitted together in love. The quilt had been waiting, after all, ready to be rediscovered by someone who believed in telling stories that bring warmth and unity to a family's soul. At last, Sarah straightened her shoulders. She thought of the phrase she'd written, "Courage to begin anew." The truth of it resonated now more than ever. When she returned to her life, whether in the city or back here on this land, she would carry the quilt's lesson with her. Life's uncertainty might bend and shape her future, but the knowledge of her heritage would remain an unwavering anchor. She headed for the kitchen, the aroma of coffee a welcoming beacon. Outside, the world glistened in the early sunlight. Leaves rustled in the breeze, a gentle whisper reminiscent of an unspoken goodbye. Inside her mind, a quiet promise echoed. She would honor the quilt's legacy, telling and retelling its stories so that each new generation could add their own hopeful words to the tapestry. Beneath all the quiet sorrow of recent days pulsed a new, boundless sense of possibility. And with a smile, Sarah embraced it wholeheartedly, just as she had embraced the quilt and all the hidden stories stitched into its soul.